the laptop feed up, that would be great. While we sort all this out, maybe you'd like to take your Bible and turn to Genesis chapter 24. Genesis chapter 24. If you're using the church Bible, we're going to be on page 23. Page 23, Genesis chapter 24. If you're using your own gizmo, feel free to boot it up. And you can see a website on the bottom right corner of the screen there. When I start teaching in a moment, you'll be able to follow what I'm saying there if you want to. And I know there's at least one of us who's going to do that, and I know a few other people do. So you can follow the message as we go along, but I warn you, I'm likely to go off piece this morning a little bit. We're looking at what I'm going to call the heart-stopping search for Mrs. Right. How to find a life's partner, because that's what happens in Genesis chapter 24. And this is the last of our series about the life of Abraham, certainly the last one I should be preaching on. And it's a very moving story about how Abraham finds a wife for his son Isaac. Abraham was now old and well advanced in years. And the Lord had blessed him in every way. He said to the chief servant in his household, the one in charge of all that he had, "Put your hand under my thigh. I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I am living, but will go to my country, to my own relatives, to get a wife for my son Isaac." Your servant asked him, "What if the woman is unwilling to come back with me to the land, to this land? Shall I then take your son back to the country you came from?" "No," said Abraham, "make sure you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who brought me out of my father's household and my native land, and who spoke to me and promised me on oath, saying, 'To your offspring I will give this land,' he will send his angel before you so that you can get a wife for my son from there. And if the woman is unwilling to come back with you, then you are released from this oath of mine. Only do not take my son back there." And so the servant put his hand under the thigh of his master Abraham and swore an oath to him concerning this matter. Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels and left, taking with him all kinds of goods and things from his master. He set out for Aram Naharaim and made his way to the town of Nahor. He made the camels kneel down near the well outside the town. It was towards evening, the time the women go out to draw water. And then he prayed, "O Lord, God of my master Abraham, give me success today and show kindness to my master Abraham. See, I'm standing beside this spring, and the daughters of the townspeople are coming out to draw water. May it be that when I say to a girl, 'Please let down your jar that I may have a drink,' and she says, 'Drink and I'll water your camels too,' Lord, let her be the one that you have chosen for your servant Isaac. By this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master." Before he had finished praying, Rebekah came out with her jar on her shoulder. She was a daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, who was the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor. The girl was very beautiful, a virgin. No man had ever lain with her. She went down to the spring, filled up her jar, and came up again. The servant hurried to meet her and said, "Please give me a little water from your jar." "Drink, my lord," she said, and quickly lowered the jar to her hands and gave him a drink. after she had given him a drink, she said, "I'll draw water for your camels too, until they have finished drinking." So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough, ran back to the well to draw more water, and drew enough for all of his camels. Without saying a word, the man watched her closely to learn whether or not the Lord had made his journey successful. When the camels had finished drinking, the man took out a gold nose ring weighing a becker and 2 gold bracelets weighing 10 shekels. Then he asked, "Whose daughter are you? Please tell me, is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night?" She answered him, "I'm the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the son that Milcah bore to Nahor." And she added, "We have plenty of straw and fodder, as well as a room for you to spend the night." And the man bowed down and worshipped the Lord, saying, "Gosh." No, he didn't. He said, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his kindness and his faithfulness to my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on the journey to the very house of my master's relatives." The girl ran and told her mother's household about all these things. Now Rebekah had a brother named Laban, and he hurried out to the man at the spring. As soon as he had seen the nose ring and the bracelets on his sister's arms, and had heard Rebekah tell about the man that met her, he went out to the man and found him standing by the camels near the spring. "Come, you who are blessed by the Lord," he said. "Why are you standing out here? I've prepared the house and a place for the camels." So the man went into the house, and the camels were unloaded. Straw and fodder were brought out for the camels, and water for him and his men to wash their feet. Then food was set before him. But he said, "I will not eat until I have told you what I have to say." "Well, then tell us," Laban said. So he said, "I am Abraham's servant. The Lord has blessed my master abundantly, and he has become wealthy. He has given him sheep and cattle and silver and gold and men servants and maidservants and camels and donkeys. My master's wife Sarah has borne him a son in her old age. And he has given him everything he owns. And my master made me swear an oath, saying, 'You must get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites in whose land I live.' Sorry, you must not get a son from there, but let me get it right. But go to my father's family, to my own clan, and get a wife for my son." And then there's a lot of repetition. I'm going to pick it up in verse 61. Then Rebekah and her maids got ready and mounted their camels and went back with the man. So the servant took Rebekah and left. Now Isaac had come from Beer Lahai Roi and was living in the Negev. He went out to the field one evening to meditate. And as he looked up, he saw camels approaching. Rebekah also looked up and saw Isaac. She got down from her camel and asked the servant, "Who is this man in the field coming to meet us?" "He is my master," the servant answered. So she took her veil and covered herself. Then the servant told Isaac all that he had done. Isaac brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah, and he married Rebekah. So she became his wife, and he loved her. And Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Isn't it a wonderful story? This week, Rosie and I, for those of you new to the church, Rosie's my wife, Rosie and I celebrated our 37th wedding anniversary. And she said to me, "You won't say anything cheesy, will you?" So I won't, except I would do it all over again. He goes, in a few days' time, Dave and Ophelia celebrate their first wedding anniversary. Do you know, when Rosie and I started out in the ministry, one of the things that we did in my role in Purley Baptist Church was to prepare couples for marriage. And it was a church where there were a lot of weddings. And sometimes we did our marriage preparation in groups. Each group would consist of 3 or 4 engaged couples, Rosie and me, and a, quote, older couple. Someone who'd been married a bit longer than we had, because we hadn't been married that long at that time. Now, they had been married nearly 30 years, and I remember thinking that must have been an impossibly long time to be married. Gosh, doesn't the clock do funny things? And now that's us. And if the early days of finding a life's partner for us seems a long time ago, guys, it was. It was a very long time ago. Our own experience of finding our life's partner is nearly 4 decades old. Actually, when Rosie saw this title, The Heart-Stopping Search for Mrs. Right, she looked at the screen and she said to me, well, if you've got it wrong, it's a bit late now, isn't it? Well, our passage here is not just 4 decades into history, it's 4 millennia into history. So it's really old. But what I'd like to do today, and if you want to follow the text, you can go to that website on the bottom there. It should come up in a minute again. I want to share with you that some things haven't changed. And you'll find these notes on the back of your news sheet. You can jot down some notes or fill in the gaps if you like. Some things, even over 4 millennia, have not changed. Film directors know that if you want to sell a film, usually it needs to have some romantic element packed into the plot. And in Genesis 24, we have a classic romance, albeit set in the ancient Near Eastern society. It's packed with drama and suspense and surprise. In fact, it's the longest chapter in Genesis. More space is devoted to Isaac finding his wife than is to the whole of creation in Genesis chapter 1. So what is it that hasn't changed? My friends, human nature hasn't changed, really. We are still very similar to the people who were around in Isaac's time. Our desire for stable, happy homes has never altered. Our desire to find fulfillment with someone who will be the completion of our lives is still as strong today as it was in it was 4,000 years ago. More than that, God's will hasn't changed. His will is seen in families who put him first and reap the rewards of faithfully following him. And that's part of the message of Genesis in the story of Abraham. And society can be strong and stable only where the marriage bond is respected and cherished. But while there are some things that haven't changed, there are other things that have changed enormously since Genesis chapter 24. We tend to think of the process of finding a husband or a wife as a sequence. We begin with contact, which leads to dating, then we go into courtship, engagement and marriage. And for about 40% of marriages today, they began on an internet dating website. Now, Genesis 24 was an Eastern marriage. It was an arranged marriage. And that arranging process was delegated to Abraham's servant. No pressure then. I tell you, there are 1 or 2 people in the Bible I'm glad I wasn't. And he's one of them. I think the responsibility must have been incredible. The weight on his shoulders of finding a wife for his son, for his master's son. And of course in their society, parents guided the matchmaking process, as Abraham did here. Don't get a wife from the Canaanites, go and find someone who's related to us back at home. By this time, of course, Abraham's wife Sarah had just died. And therefore they were a grieving family. And they lived in a society without rapid communication. So the servant would know all of this and would be mulling it over as he made his way from where Abraham was living to the homeland from which he had emerged. Now, Abraham and his entourage were living as nomads. They were foreigners in Canaan. And although the text makes it sound as if it happened the next day, actually the distance between where they were and where the servant had to go was round about 500 miles, if you look at a map. And therefore, this journey would have taken many months. Hence the need for a multiplicity of camels to go there and to come back again. And Abraham was a remarkable man because he could see that God wanted his son to have a wife who would be in the covenant, part of his family, to whom God had promised numerous descendants. Now, actually, if we look at the process, we find that several times this promise nearly went sour. This promise that Abraham would give rise to a whole nation nearly ran aground several times. In chapter 21, for example, we looked a few weeks ago at this character Abimelech, who took Sarah to be his wife. And had God not intervened, Abraham would not have had her back. And Isaac would never have been born. In the next scene, in chapter 21, Sarah thought God couldn't give her a son because she was too old. But God intervened and Isaac was born. In the next chapter, in chapter 22, Isaac is almost sacrificed by Abraham, but God intervened to provide a sacrifice on his behalf. And here in chapter 24, Abraham knew that for God's purposes to come into being, Isaac must marry the right person. In fact, Isaac would have remained a single man had God not intervened in the way that we've just heard in that chapter. So all the way through Abraham's life, God is making sure that his promise is going to be fulfilled. Can you see that? And my friends, when we live in the promise of God, when we live in touch with him, he makes sure that his will is fulfilled in our lives. That's what we're intended to see as we read these chapters all together. And what we see here is a man finding his wife and marrying him. And there is an urgent need in our society 4,000 years later for healthy ethics of marriage, because marriage is under attack from all sorts of sources, especially in the mass media, which tend to focus on the sensational. In films, on the internet and in books, we can see extreme attitudes that by their nature are presented to us so regularly and subtly, but by their nature they are aberrations of the real thing. Life does not proceed at the pace as it does in a Neighbours or Casualty. These have drama compressed into them, and it's easy for us to falsely think that real life is like that. Even looking at Facebook, we tend to put our huge achievements up there, don't we? Forgetting that there's a lot of life that we wouldn't want on Facebook. And the Bible is very realistic about the tough stuff in life as well as the good stuff. And when the marriage bond is diluted, the home, which was the cornerstone of society, begins to break down, and society falls as a consequence. And my friends, we need to pray for our land, for our homes, for our marriages, that they may be places that are strong and stable. It also tells us, oh, there we are, all the places that nearly failed. I'll leave those up for you to jot them down if you want. This passage also tells us about the character of God. And perhaps I ought to, at this point, say a couple of things about the dangers of preaching on marriage, especially how to find a wife, or the process of finding a wife, or how it happened in Genesis 24. Because I'm acutely aware that only half or less of us in this room are actually married. Some of us are single and wish we were married. Some of us may be married and wish we were single. Some of us longed to find a life's partner, but it kind of never happened. for whatever reason. And we wrestle with God because of that. Others of us who are single, we're single by choice and regard it as a precious gift of his. Some of us are single because we are separated or divorced or widowed. In fact, for every married couple here, one of you is going to become single, unless you're both tragically killed on the same day or die very quickly, one straight after the other. One of you is going to go first. That is life. That's reality. And that's what the Bible helps us to come to terms with. We cannot ignore it. And the Christian church has always been at the risk of saying, or at least implying, that the archetypal, the best kind of life to lead is that of having a family with 2.4 children. I feel sorry for the 0.4, but there you go. And I want you to know, my friend, if you are not married today, if you're single for whatever reason, then you are just as much part of the Church of Jesus Christ and the family of God here at Victoria as anybody else. You see, this chapter shows one man finding a wife. It doesn't say that has to be the rule for all of us. And God accepts and loves all of us in spite of some of the traumas that have led us to be living a single life today. Well, let's just come to the chapter and look at one or two aspects that will help us understand what's happening here. Oh, so there's the character of God. And the first thing I want you to notice is that this passage shows us that it is in God's nature to provide. In the previous chapter, as Abraham nearly sacrifices his son Isaac, God steps in and he says, no, I will provide you with a sacrifice. Look at verse 3. I want you to swear by the Lord, said Abraham, the God of heaven and earth, that you will not get a wife from the Canaanites among whom I'm living. The Canaanites were not a pleasant group. They had quite nasty worship practices, which we need not go into today, and I can well understand why Abraham didn't want that to happen. But go to my country and to my own relatives and get a wife for my son Isaac. But how will he know the way back, and how will he even know how to get there, which city to land in or which town to go to? There were no maps that we have today. He just had to head off into the distance and hope for the best. Actually hope that God would guide him, which is exactly what happened. And that's why the servant was so flabbergasted when the first person he bumps into happens to be a relative. It shows us that it's in God's nature to provide. So let's have a look at what the servant did. Look at verse 11. He gave time to prayer. He made the camels kneel down near the well outside the town, verse 12, and then he prayed. Clearly the camels were expected to join in the prayer meeting. Oh God, the God of my master Abraham, give me success today, he said, as he knelt there. And my friends, whatever our challenge, whether it is finding a life's partner or whether it's another decision that we have to take in life, because finding a life's partner is only going to apply to a tiny, tiny fraction of us here today. My dear friends, give time to prayer. That's what the example of this man shows us. There was a missionary in Cairo who wrote a prayer in his diary when he realised he was falling in love, and it went like this: Lord, may I come near to her, but draw me nearer to you than to her. Lord, may I know her, but make me know you more than I know her. Lord, may I love her with the perfect love of a whole heart, but cause me to love you yet more than her. And God blessed that man because of his commitment to seeking God in prayer. Not only did he give time to prayer, but he looked out for God's guidance. And you'll see that in verse 7. The Lord God of heaven, who brought me out of my father's household and my native land, he will send his angel or his messenger before you so that you can get a wife for my son from my homeland. And then in verse 14, the servant wanted to be sure that it was God's guiding. May it be, he said, that when I say to this girl, please let down your jar, she says, drink and I'll water your camels too. And to his amazement, that actually happened. He looked out for God's guidance. And then I noticed in verse 20 that he expected God to confirm that to him. She quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran back to the well to draw more water and drew enough for all his camels. Now, wait a minute. There's no small task here. We know there are at least 10 camels, and an average drink for a camel is going to be about 5 gallons. So this girl is drawing 50 gallons of water out of a well, running to and fro and making sure the camels get enough to drink. So it's no wonder that in verse 26, he worshipped, and in verse 48, when he saw what God had done. And finally, can I just share with you what happened right at the very end? Isaac, verse 67, Isaac brought Rebekah to the tent of his mother Sarah, and he married Rebekah. So she became his wife, and he loved her. And Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. In this new relationship, God gave Isaac a person who would fulfill some of the aspects of love, some of his need for love that he'd lost as his mother had just died. How good God is to his children. How good he is to us. And I want to finish just by looking back over the whole of Abraham's life. And I'd like to do something in these last few moments that's quite unusual. Perhaps you wouldn't have heard of this before. You see, we know about the book of Genesis. We actually know we have other books written not by God-fearing people around the same time. And one of the things that we can do, is to compare other documents of the time with Genesis. And if we do that, we start to see some huge comparisons. You see, the way in which people understood the world in Abraham's time, judging by the documents that we still have, is they had a whole pantheon of gods, little gods, who were constantly arguing amongst one another. What have we got in Genesis? One God that Abraham gave his life to. And then also in these other documents, we get gods who are not interested in what God goes on earth. Mankind merely does the God's dirty work. Not in Genesis. Mankind is made in the image of God. We are the pinnacle of creation. And God is active in the affairs of men as much today as he was then. And then in Abraham's time, the gods had to be appeased. They had to do sacrifices and go through rituals to keep the gods happy. No. God loves his children and doesn't need to be appeased by sacrifice. That actually is the background to the whole sacrifice of Isaac. It's a demonstration to the people who first read it. Our God does not need child sacrifice, which is what the Canaanites did. And then we have God, and this is another extraordinary bit of it in terms of Noah and Abraham. We have God making a promise. Not lots of little gods getting on with their own thing. Here's the God, the creator of the universe, making a promise to Abraham and to his descendants that I will build a nation from you, and your nation will be the way in which people will understand who I am. And then here in chapter 24, we see a God who, far from being disinterested in the affairs of man, is actually intervening and making things happen one step at a time, one interaction at a time, one meeting at a time. God's here doing that, he's here doing that, he's here doing something else, and so on. That theme is woven all the way through this passage in Genesis 24. So what we have here in the book of Genesis, particularly when we compare it to other literature of the time, is a huge vision of who God is. He's a God of love and compassion. He's a God who accepts the outsider. Remember the story of Abimelech? He's a God who sees his children through to realise his will for their lives. That's what we've got here. In actual fact, the whole of the gospel is packed into Genesis. And as we look back over Abraham's life, we can see God at work. And my prayer is, as you look back over your life and as you look forward to the challenges yet to come, you'll see God at work. My prayer for you is not that we'll have great worship or you'll have a slightly fascinating sermon, or at least you'll stay awake. My prayer for you is as you leave that door, you'll have a bigger view of God than you had when you came in. Because he's here. We are God's people. We are the successors to the covenant of Abraham. Let's bow our heads for a moment's prayer, shall we?